The moon is rotten. I don't even know where to begin. If you've managed to stop this, you're in trouble. If you're one of the bastards who put me through this nightmare, I hope you rot. Either way, I hope this message reaches as many people as possible. You at least deserve a little warning of what's coming. My name is Pierce Valence. For the past 7 years, which I believe has been 7 years, because I've lost track of time, I've been on the moon. I'm a geologist sent here to help with a mining operation after some unknown new mineral was discovered. Unfortunately, I'm the last one left alive, and I don't know how much longer I'll be alive. So consider this my last will and testament. I'm not leaving, and I'll be damned if I take that rotten thing off this asteroid. I guess if there's any consolation, it's that the leaders of the project have gone before me. The space race is over. It's become a relay race. It's not about who gets there first, it's about getting there, establishing a territory, and seeing what you can find. The United States has teamed up with other countries like China, the former Soviet Union, India. Basically, any country that can launch a satellite into orbit will get an invitation. Hooray for world unity, right? Well, why am I telling you all this? So that you know that scientists are working together to bring human civilization to the brink of collapse through their efforts. A lot of resources and money went into building this little outpost on the moon, although I have no idea what it was for. Finally, maybe 6 years ago, according to the brief I got, they started mining. Initially, the goal was something like, let's find out what's under the surface. Sounds harmless, right? Find some rare minerals that could change the way the Earth works. Except mining is what got us into this stupid situation. About 3 years ago, they found the Great Table. That's just a term coined to refer to its existence. Regular mining operations had created a dense network of tunnels under the moon's surface and ended up accidentally drilling straight into this giant cavern. Sounds like a big discovery, right? The hollow moon had been a theory on paper among our crazy conspiracies. Turned out to be real. It was huge, quite close to the center of the moon, but it was completely unreasonable. The size of the place made no sense when compared to our measurements of the moon itself. For the area of the entire surface, the tunnels we had dug and everything else, it looked like it took up much more space than it physically could. But strangely enough, it made no difference if you looked down from the surface. That immediately threw everyone into confusion. Of course, my presence here was to do a geological survey, to test the samples the excavation team brought back, to examine them and compare them with what was on Earth. I agreed because the initial salary was quite good, especially since the work was so easy. Most of the material found in the cavity was silicious basalt, with occasional iron inclusions, similar to what we found on the surface. I still remember watching live as they broke into the cave. We had dug down to maybe 300 miles below the surface of the moon. As for what they were trying to find, I don't know if they were hoping to find water or a new energy source. Instead, we found a large, empty, continuously sloping cave. Honestly, I was surprised when we didn't plummet from the top, but instead crashed almost perfectly perpendicular to the floor. They had installed an elevator system to easily transport people down from the tunnel they had dug up to the surface. And I'll tell you, just stepping into that cave is enough to make your brain explode. As you know, one thing the moon has in its favor is that there's no light pollution. You can see distant stars that were and are, entire galaxies that can be seen almost with the naked eye if you look hard enough. It's the most beautiful view I've ever seen, and the best part is that you can see it no matter where you stand on the surface. But inside that cave, the darkness is indescribable. It's like an endless void, and even with our brightest lights on, we couldn't see the top of it. There was no ceiling above, just the absence of light, the total darkness of anything. It was the first time I had ever seen such a deep darkness, and a primal feeling surged through my veins. Every instinct told me to run, but where to? After setting up camp and exploring the cave, we never found the end of it. The whole place seemed to go on forever, even after we had traveled what we estimated to be 600 miles. There was just no way it could be. It was too absurd not to find an end given the limited size of the moon. I fully expected to come across a giant cave wall ready to burst through the surface on the other side, or at least hit something. But no, we kept moving until we found the Great Table. I wasn't part of the mission to find the first piece of corruption, and could only watch the video when they were brought back to our base. The videos of the situation they faced, man, it was like a bad movie. The pale light from their suits illuminated the solid rock in every direction, and the darkness beyond slowly encroached as if it were trying to swallow the team. And then the color of the cliffs began to change. It happened so slowly that at first it was barely noticeable, just a slight shadow creeping into the gray rock. Eventually, it began to gather, turning the gray into a charcoal black. By the time anyone realized it, it was completely over, so dark that it merged with the abyss around them, making the ground almost indistinguishable from space. Even though they immediately turned up the light intensity, it still looked like the group was just floating in endless space, ready to fall to the ground at any moment. Occasionally, there would be a crack in the floor, a dark green color breaking the black. I couldn't really blame the group for hesitating to check it, but after a while, one of them noticed that the cracks seemed to be pulsating. Finally, someone exclaimed that it was glowing, and that was where the first mistake was made. The 5 members of the team huddled together, one on top of the other, in a line as the darkness began to close. With each dimming of the lights, the green glow from the cracks became more apparent. They pulsed rhythmically, the light rising and falling in waves. The team took a moment to orient themselves, turning off their lights while facing the source of the pulse. The last person in line stumbled, his hand slipping from the person in front of him as he shuffled. He let out a short, panicked scream and then fell silent. The camera screen flickered with static. The rest of the team turned on their lights immediately, shouting names and circling around. Their cameras panned in every direction, desperately searching for their friend who had been there only minutes ago, but there was none. Only the cracks still flickered green against their pale lights. The 5th member of the team was gone, nowhere to be seen. Their faces must have been etched with fear as the cameras on their suits kept shaking. Everyone turned around, desperately trying to find their comrades. It had been 5 years, and looking back, that was the exact sign that we needed to get out of here. The team returned to camp. Over the next few days, none of them were normal. Their spirits had collapsed, and their health had begun to fail with constant insomnia. When they were brought back through my section of the base, it looked like I was facing lifeless bodies. By this time, they were too weak to take off their suits, and we were worried that they might break an arm or leg if they walked outside. They just withered away in our base, until they were brought back to the surface and I realized they were dead, and their bodies had rotted to the point of melting. The decomposition was so intense that their bodies almost fell apart in a matter of hours. I don't know if it was the sudden return to the surface or the change in atmospheric pressure. The rotting corpses swaying around inside those protective suits. Oh my God, just thinking about it makes me sick. The footage we got from up here a few days later was even more disturbing. The fear I had seen on their faces just a few days before was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Looking back at the footage, I guess my colleagues down below had absolutely no idea what to do with the rotting bodies in those suits. So they just took them to cold storage in the hope of delaying the further decomposition. The bodies were thrown into the cold room as a makeshift morgue, with the suits still intact. Maybe 12 hours after they were thrown into the cold storage, one of the 4 bodies suddenly got up and started walking around as if nothing had happened, and the other 3 got up shortly after. Then they started banging on the door, and I swear we could hear the screams on the recording, begging to be released, wailing in pain and misery. The first guy to respond to their cries for help, and perhaps the luckiest of us all, was immediately grabbed as the door opened, his limbs being held by the 4 corpses. Can you imagine a medieval scene of 4 horses tearing them apart? Well, that's what it looked like, just dragging on and on until they fell apart. Another guy rushed in as soon as he heard the screams and started firing into the chaos. The suit seemed to deflate as soon as the bullets penetrated, leaving behind rotting bones and melted flesh. Honestly, I don't know if their souls were released from the suit or if they would be trapped inside forever. But one thing I can say for sure is that the bullets didn't kill them outright, but the release of pressure made it harder for them to move around in the suit. They hadn't moved much since then, not for lack of trying, just that they couldn't go far in such a terrible state. However, the guy they'd torn apart was really gone. At least death was better than surviving in such a miserable state. For some strange reason, the higher-ups kept sending people to explore the cave, even after they'd seen the inexplicable horror. I guess it was to justify the expense, or maybe they just didn't want to give up because they'd already invested so much money. Overcoming our worries and fears, we found the Great Table a few miles farther than the furthest the first group had gone. Faint cracks stretched out into a vast, dark central space. There was nothing but the giant rock in the middle. The rock was the same dark black as the surrounding cliffs. It was so dark that one of the group ran headlong into it without realizing it. For a moment, they thought it was the end of the road, but then they realized that they could go around it. All in all, it took nearly 12 hours to go around the entire rock, and we couldn't tell how high it was. However, the cracks ended below the base of the rock. The green pulsated much more than before. Each burst of light that passed through it seemed to be breathing. As for what was going on, I didn't know who was giving the orders for all the work we had to do here. However, it was an order, and we had no choice but to obey. A new camp had been set up next to the Great Table for the purpose of extracting some samples from the rock. Except they couldn't, because nothing could cut through it, not even the most advanced mining tools we had brought with us. They used every kind of excavator, diamond drill, plasma, but none of it was enough to scratch that giant rock. They used all sorts of tools, but nothing could make a dent in the giant rock. The expedition team tried to examine it, but the Great Table was too large to get any readings. There was nothing on Earth or the materials we had discovered on the moon that matched the element. We spent the next several months studying it, with the expedition team at the Great Table collecting samples. It was probably a year and a half ago that Surface Command sent down orders to try and destroy the rock to see if it would be easier to control. So they drew up a plan to set up explosions around it in the hopes of blowing it up. We all voiced our concerns, but the command was deaf. They didn't listen to any of our pleas for help. I couldn't understand what kind of idiot would suggest blowing up this nameless rock with explosives. And so we were told that if the crew at the Great Table still refused to do it, they would be replaced by another group. At the same time, those of us at the lab were also likely to fall into the same situation if we didn't prove our worth. Unfortunately, that was the end of it. I still remember very clearly the moment when all my colleagues at the lab gathered around the live camera screen of the explosion from the expedition team to see if this was completely useless or the beginning of our damnation. I think everyone knew that what we were doing was going to be bad. Either continue to risk for fame and reward, or go home empty-handed. A series of controlled explosives were placed around the base of the Great Table. Everyone quickly dispersed to make room for the explosion. And boom, when the smoke finally cleared, all it left was a small crack in the middle, right where it connected to the ground. The crack spread upwards, jagged and thin. It was actually incredibly small compared to the sheer size of the rock. Still, there was enough for a faint blue light from within to shine through the crack, spreading outwards. The place where it met the floor also began to crack, spreading along the corner and separating from the stone. We were only able to break the Great Table a little, and that was enough. A few of the expedition team stepped closer to the crack to investigate, but we still didn't really know what had happened to them. From the brief moment captured on camera, it looked like they had been sucked in. Their clothes were twisted and folded as their bodies remained inside. They were all pulled into the crack. They barely had time to scream, but were essentially compressed into nothingness. As soon as they got close to the damn thing, it was like a black hole confined within a 2-meter radius of the Great Table. The signal continued to transmit for a few more seconds before fading away, showing the hideously crushed suits and the people inside. Needless to say, the commanders didn't send anyone else to get closer. But that didn't matter much, because everything had already begun to decline steadily. The corruption had officially taken over. The corruption began slowly but spread, originating from cracks in the Great Table. At first, the physical signs were subtle when you were close, but the mental toll it took was undeniable. Those living near the camp below began to break down, changing both physically and mentally. Their bodies atrophied, sometimes in a matter of days, sometimes in weeks. And then their minds slowly followed their bodies. Prolonged memory loss, rambling speech, and sudden violent outbursts of insanity. There was no real pattern to how people were infected. It seemed to pick up randomly, settling in with relative subtlety at first. The first signs of the disease were loss of appetite, insomnia, and irritability. This quickly led to chaos. Many of the personnel assigned to the Great Table Camp developed resentment and paranoia toward their fellow humans. When symptoms appear, they often become delusional and violent, with a shocking disregard for the safety of themselves and others. The violent and isolated attacks become more frequent as the infection progresses. In their weakened state, they turn to attacking their fellow humans, believing that this will slow the deterioration of their bodies. Whether or not this is true is another matter, but they don't seem to care. They believe that the more gruesome the killing, the more they can save themselves from the hell they are experiencing. The corpses begin to pile up in even more disgusting ways. The demented will cut up other bodies and turn them into makeshift altars to some god. In fact, this is what we call it: corruption. Many who still had the ability to speak would whisper about feeding the corruption as a way to appease it, to give it a defenseless body to start decaying. They tended to only attack the healthier ones, so things just started to deteriorate faster. At first, they were able to control the exposure, but eventually the sick outnumbered the healthy, or at least the ones who were still alive. Remember, I didn't see how things played out near the Great Table. I only knew from the reports sent by the few staff who were still conscious. When no one was conscious enough, a few colleagues from nearby camps would stand back and watch, then return. The commanders sent a message back, and it was pretty much over right there. We all collectively handed in our resignations, stormed the main facility on the surface, and asked to be sent home before things got too far, which was probably a stupid thought in retrospect, since we knew full well that no one could leave. For a few days, we forgot all about the chaos below the surface as things went from bad to worse above. People began to riot and turn violent in the face of impending doom. Some lost their tempers, while others tried to calm themselves. Either way, none of us had much time. Those of us stationed at the farthest point from the Great Table managed to make it to the surface, but the other camps closer were already in chaos. Most of the camps had fallen into civil war within weeks. The blackness of the rock spread farther and farther away from it. A message from the camp closest to the Great Table said the rot had reached their site only about a week after things had gone bad. 6 months had passed, and the entire area was a dark, rotten place, stretching all the way to the elevator shaft I had originally been assigned to. Needless to say, the elevator was closed, so luckily I had made it back up, though it felt like I was just delaying the inevitable. The real trouble began not long after everyone fled to the surface. We had shut down the elevator, essentially creating our own little security force at the top, constantly on the lookout for any members of the corruption or those corrupted by it who tried to make their way up. I was given the incredibly difficult task of monitoring the camera screens. Honestly, the first time I entered the surveillance room felt like we were being tested, being watched. Cameras were everywhere below, recording every little movement we made. Not sure who had invested in monitoring all of them before I arrived, but to me it was like watching death slowly creep up on us. At this point, everything below was corrupted. Cracks had spread, dragging the darkness from the Great Table deep into the cliff. As they spread, the light from the cracks grew stronger, as if coming to life with each new research camp they consumed. The poor souls were still down there. Well, not really, they weren't themselves anymore anyway. The decay of humans grew much faster the farther it got from the Great Table. The symptoms increased exponentially as the distance between the beginning and end of the cracks grew, leading to spontaneous violent outbursts that were even more horrific than before. The rotting bodies quickly became trapped in their shriveled muscles, leaving decaying corpses behind. Some people weren't mentally disturbed, but it was all the worse to witness. These people were clearly aware that they were rotting, but completely helpless. I saw one poor man wake up one night, his body withering away. When he tried to stand up, his leg bones snapped in two. He was trapped there, and I watched his body deteriorate over the next few hours. As his body began to decompose, the skin peeled away, revealing his skull and eyeballs hanging from his sockets. I tried to turn off the camera as he stared straight at it, as if he were reaching through the screen into my damn soul. The sight haunted me for a long time, both terrifying and tragic. The cracks had reached the elevators before they stopped altogether. We really thought we were saved. The cracks were no longer a problem, and we even spent a few months fooling ourselves into thinking we could get out. Some people sent radio signals back to Earth, trying to contact anyone who could help, but all to no avail. Then the flowers began to appear. At first, I wasn't sure if I was still sane or if I had finally lost my mind. Maybe the constant stress had caused my mind to drift into delusion, or worse, the corruption had found its way into me. It took me a few minutes of confusion before I could confirm that I wasn't going crazy. One day, while checking any cameras that were still working below, I discovered a much more horrifying scene. It was the man I had seen earlier, who had broken his leg trying to stand and was forced to sit still, feeling his body slowly decay in agony. By this point, his body was nothing more than a shattered skeleton, with his eyeballs hanging loose and whatever internal organs remained still rotting. But deep in the eye socket where the eyeballs hung, a bright blue flower had bloomed. I couldn't believe my eyes. It must have been an illusion, but after switching back and forth between cameras, I realized that it wasn't just him. In many other areas, similar flowers were blooming. They grew from corpses, from bodies that had rotted and decayed. The corpses near the great table were the first to go through the whole process. Their bodies were covered in a carpet of bright, colorful flowers. But that wasn't the end. After the flowers bloomed, they began to move, regenerating life from the corpses. They moved slowly at first, like children learning to walk, but soon they were up and walking as if they were alive. These flower zombies began to gather, moving step by step towards the elevator where we had taken refuge. I had warned the others as soon as the flower event began, but that did not prepare us any better. The zombies came in greater numbers, and before we could react, the elevator was destroyed, becoming an open portal for these creatures to flood to the surface. There was no other way. I had to flee. I locked myself in the surveillance room, my last remaining safe place. But I knew that my time was running out. The green cracks had spread all the way here. The darkness and corruption could not be stopped. I came up with a desperate plan. Destroy the entire base by exploding the remaining oxygen and fuel. The ventilation system will be activated to increase the oxygen level, creating conditions for a large explosion. I will burn all flammable materials and use gasoline to spread the fire everywhere. As I move through the hallway to the control room, vines have begun to creep through the cracks of the door. I know I don't have much time left. The wound on my shoulder, where a flower petal cut through, has begun to bloom. Small flowers grow from my flesh, sucking my blood and life. Finally, I reach the control room. I activate the system, increase the oxygen level to the maximum, and open the gas valve in the rib area. But as I try to light the fire, the flower zombies find me. The vines pierce my back. The pain is indescribable. I don't know if I succeeded, but I did all I could. The fire flares up, burning everything. I pray that the fire will end this nightmare, to protect the Earth from decay. If this message reaches you, remember, never go to the moon. There is only darkness, dead flowers, and the end.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.